Beloved brothers and sisters, from the depths of our hearts, we lift our eyes to God, just as the words of Psalm 20 rise like incense before his throne. In a world where negativity surrounds us and envy quietly works its harm, we do not answer with bitterness or fear. We answer with prayer, trust, and holy confidence in the Lord who hears. The prayer of Psalm 20 teaches us that our help does not come from human strength or clever defense, but from God who sees every hidden intention. When envy speaks against us, God listens to the cry of the faithful. When negative voices seek to weaken our spirit, the Lord becomes our shield. He does not ignore the wounds caused by jealous hearts. He heals them with his presence and restores peace within us. This sacred prayer reminds us to place our burdens before God rather than carrying them alone. We ask him to silence harmful plans, to dissolve envy at its root, and to protect our hearts from becoming like those who hurt us. The faithful soul does not fight darkness with darkness, but with light. God answers not always by removing people, but by removing their power over our peace. As we trust in the name of the Lord spoken throughout the book of Psalms, we learn that victory begins in prayer. God grants strength to endure, wisdom to discern, and grace to remain pure. He lifts us above negativity and teaches us to walk in love, even when surrounded by envy. May this prayer shape our hearts, guard our paths, and remind us that the Lord saves his people. We rise, not troubled, but confident, knowing that God hears, God answers, and God delivers those who place their trust in him. When the heart turns toward God in times of distress, it learns a sacred truth that Psalm 20 gently unfolds. Protection is not something we manufacture by our own effort, nor is it secured by arguing with those who oppose us. True protection is received when we place ourselves fully into the care of the Lord. In the presence of negativity and envy, the soul often feels compelled to defend itself, to explain, to resist, or to retaliate. Yet this holy prayer teaches us a quieter, deeper way, one that rests not in human strength, but in divine faithfulness. The psalm opens with confidence that God hears in the day of trouble, not because the trouble is loud, but because the prayer is sincere. This alone brings comfort to the faithful heart, for it assures us that we are never unheard, even when surrounded by voices that wish us harm. Negative and envious people often operate in unseen ways. Their words may be subtle, their intentions hidden, and their influence slow yet damaging. They drain peace, distort truth, and plant seeds of doubt within the mind. Psalm 20 does not instruct us to confront such people with force or clever words. Instead, it turns our attention upward, reminding us that God sees what we cannot see and understands motives that remain concealed from human judgment. To trust God as protector is to believe that no envy is stronger than his justice and no negative intention is greater than his care. When the soul accepts this, it is freed from constant anxiety and the exhausting need to defend itself. Placing our protection in God requires humility because it asks us to admit our limitations. We are not always able to change others, and often we cannot remove ourselves from their presence. Families, workplaces, communities, and even places of worship can become spaces where envy quietly grows. Psalm 20 invites us to release the burden of control and place it into God's hands. This act of surrender is not weakness. It is a form of spiritual strength. The faithful heart learns that God's protection does not always appear as immediate relief, but as steady preservation of the inner life. While negative people may speak, their words lose power. While envy may rise, it fails to take root. The psalm speaks of God sending help from his sanctuary, reminding us that divine help comes from a holy source, untouched by human corruption. This teaches us that protection is not merely about escaping harm, but about remaining whole within it. God guards the heart so it does not become hardened, guards the mind so it does not become restless, and guards the spirit so it does not become bitter. In this way, protection becomes an inner fortress rather than an outer wall. The faithful person learns to dwell in peace even when circumstances remain challenging, because God Himself becomes the dwelling place of the soul. Negativity often seeks to provoke reaction. Envy hopes to awaken anger, pride, or despair. When we respond impulsively, we give power to what seeks to harm us. Psalm 20 quietly leads us away from this trap by directing us to prayer. Prayer becomes a shield, not because it changes others immediately, but because it changes us. As we pray, the heart softens, the spirit steadies, and trust deepens. We begin to see that God's protection includes wisdom to remain silent when silence is holy, patience to endure when endurance is required, and courage to stand firm without hostility. The psalm also reminds us that God remembers the offerings of the faithful. This speaks of a life lived in sincerity before Him. When our lives are rooted in prayer, humility, and trust, we place ourselves under God's attentive care. Negative and envious people may attempt to undermine such a life, but God honors faithfulness more than accusation. He guards what is offered to Him in truth. This assurance gives peace to the believer who feels misunderstood or unfairly judged, knowing that God's remembrance is greater than human opinion. Trusting God as protector reshapes the way we see opposition. Instead of viewing negative people as enemies to be defeated, we begin to see them as challenges through which faith is refined. Psalm 20 does not deny the presence of conflict, but it refuses to let conflict define the faithful soul. It teaches us to remain steady, to avoid the temptation of revenge, and to believe that God's justice operates beyond our timing and methods. This trust allows the heart to remain light, unburdened by resentment, and open to grace. The psalm speaks of some trusting in chariots and others in horses, but the faithful remembering the name of the Lord. This contrast reveals a deep spiritual truth. Human defenses may appear strong, but they often fail. Arguments, influence, reputation, and power can collapse under pressure. Trust in God, however, stands firm. When negativity rises, it often relies on human tools such as gossip, manipulation, or fear. The believer who trusts in God refuses to engage in these weapons, choosing instead the quiet strength of prayer. This choice may appear weak to the world, but it is the source of lasting peace. God's protection is also shown in the way He preserves hope. Envy seeks to diminish joy, to make success feel heavy, and to turn blessings into sources of guilt or fear. Psalm 20 teaches us that God desires the fulfillment of righteous plans. When our intentions are pure, we need not fear the envy of others. God's protection ensures that what He has planted cannot be destroyed by human jealousy. This brings freedom to live openly, thankfully, and without constant self-defense. As we pray this psalm, we learn that protection does not mean absence of struggle, but presence of God within it. The faithful heart begins to rest, knowing that God stands between the soul and unseen harm. Negative words may be spoken, but they fall short. Envy may burn, but it consumes itself, rather than the one who trusts in the Lord. This confidence does not come from arrogance, but from deep reliance on God's mercy. The prayer of Psalm 20 draws the believer into a community of trust, reminding us that God saves His people. Protection is not only personal, but shared. When we pray, we stand with others who seek God's help, forming a quiet fellowship of faith. This shared trust strengthens the soul, making it less vulnerable to isolation, which negativity often uses as its strongest weapon. Knowing that God watches over his people collectively reassures the heart that it does not stand alone. In learning to trust God as protector, the believer also learns restraint. Not every battle must be fought, not every accusation answered, not every envious glance confronted. Psalm 20 teaches discernment, allowing God to decide what requires action and what requires patience. This discernment itself is a form of protection, guarding the soul from unnecessary conflict and emotional exhaustion. The deeper one dwells in this prayer, the more the heart becomes anchored in peace. The fear of being harmed by negativity slowly fades, replaced by confidence in God's watchful care. This confidence does not depend on circumstances improving, but on faith maturing. The soul becomes steady, like a tree planted near water, drawing life from a source unseen but ever present. Through the wisdom tree, served in the book of Psalms, Psalm 20 continues to speak to every generation, inviting believers to rest in God's protection. It assures us that while others may rise and fall, those who trust in the Lord stand firm. Negativity may surround them, envy may challenge them, but their hearts remain guarded by divine peace. In this trust, the faithful find strength not to retaliate, but to endure, not to fear, but to hope, not to be consumed by darkness, but to remain in the light of God's saving presence. Prayer has a mysterious power that works first within the heart before it ever reshapes the world around us. And Psalm 20 gently reveals this sacred process. When we come before God burdened by negativity and wounded by envy, our first desire is often for change outside ourselves. We want situations to improve, people to soften, and opposition to disappear. Yet this psalm leads us along a quieter path, teaching that God's deepest work begins in the inner life. Before he alters circumstances, he steadies the soul. Before he silences harmful voices, he calms the restless heart. This inner transformation is not a delay in God's answer. It is the answer taking root. Negativity has a way of stirring the spirit into unrest. Envy unsettles peace by making us question our worth, our calling, and even God's fairness. Left unattended, these feelings slowly reshape the heart, bending it toward bitterness or discouragement. Psalm 20 invites the believer into prayer not as an escape, but as a place of realignment. In prayer, the heart is gently turned back toward truth. The soul remembers that it stands before God, not before the judgment of others. This remembrance weakens the hold of negativity, because it shifts the center of attention from human opinion to divine presence. Prayer reshapes perception. What once felt overwhelming begins to appear smaller when placed in God's hands. This does not mean that pain is denied or that injustice is ignored. Rather, prayer gives pain a rightful place, no longer ruling the heart, but resting within God's care. Psalm 20 teaches that God hears in the day of trouble, and this assurance alone changes the way trouble is carried. The believer no longer bears it in isolation. The weight is shared, and in that sharing, the heart grows lighter. As prayer continues, the inner voice grows quieter and more honest. Envy often provokes comparison, and comparison leads to dissatisfaction. In prayer, the soul is called back to gratitude. The heart begins to recognize the gifts already received, rather than the approval withheld by others. Psalm 20 speaks of God granting the desires of the heart, not selfish desires, but those shaped by trust and righteousness. As prayer refines desire, envy loses its grip. The believer learns to rejoice without fear and to succeed without guilt, knowing that God's blessing does not depend on the silence of critics. Prayer also teaches patience, a virtue deeply opposed to negativity. Negative influences thrive on urgency, pushing the soul to react quickly, often unwisely. In prayer, time slows. The heart learns to wait, to listen, and to discern. Psalm 20 reminds us that God answers in His time, and this waiting becomes a school of peace. The believer begins to understand that not every situation requires immediate resolution. Some matters are meant to be placed before God and left there, trusting that He is at work even when nothing appears to change. Through prayer, the heart is gradually healed of resentment. Envy wounds not only the one who envies, but also the one who is envied, creating tension, suspicion, and emotional distance. When these wounds are brought into prayer, they are exposed to God's healing light. The believer learns to release the desire for vindication and replaces it with trust in God's justice. Psalm 20 does not encourage revenge or self-defense through aggression. Instead, it leads the heart to a place where forgiveness becomes possible, not forced, but born out of peace. Prayer strengthens the inner life against fear. Negativity often whispers that harm is inevitable and that protection is uncertain. In prayer, these whispers are confronted by truth. The heart remembers God's faithfulness, not only in the present, but across generations. The words of Psalm 20 echo with confidence that God saves His people. This assurance builds courage, allowing the believer to walk calmly, even when surrounded by hostility. Fear may still appear, but it no longer controls the heart. As prayer transforms the inner world, the believer's response to others also changes. Where once there may have been defensiveness, there is now gentleness. Where there was anger, there is restraint. This does not mean weakness or passivity. Rather, it is strength under control, guided by wisdom. Psalm 20 shapes a heart that trusts God enough to remain composed. Such composure itself becomes a quiet testimony, often disarming negativity more effectively than argument ever could. Prayer also restores clarity of purpose. Envy distracts, pulling attention away from God's calling and toward comparison with others. In prayer, the believer is reminded of their unique path. Psalm 20 speaks of God fulfilling righteous plans, affirming that each life has meaning beyond competition. As the heart reconnects with this truth, focus returns. Energy once spent worrying about others is redirected toward faithfulness, service, and growth. This inner transformation deepens humility. Prayer reveals that all strength comes from God, not from personal ability or social approval. Psalm 20 contrasts those who trust in worldly power with those who trust in the Lord. As prayer shapes the heart, pride is softened and dependence on God grows. This dependence becomes a source of peace rather than insecurity. The believer no longer needs to prove worth, because worth is received, not earned. Prayer also nurtures hope, especially when circumstances remain unchanged. Negativity loses power when hope is alive. Psalm 20 does not promise immediate relief, but it promises God's presence. In prayer, the heart learns to hope, not in outcomes, but in God Himself. This hope is steady and resilient, able to endure disappointment without despair. It allows the believer to move forward with quiet confidence, trusting that God's purposes are unfolding beyond visible evidence. As the inner life is transformed, prayer becomes less about asking and more about abiding. The believer begins to dwell in God's presence, finding rest there. Negativity may still exist outside, but it no longer penetrates the soul as deeply. Envy may still be encountered, but it fails to disturb inner peace. Psalm 20 leads the heart to this place of abiding trust, where faith is not reactive, but rooted. The power of this prayerful transformation is preserved throughout the book of Psalms, reminding believers across generations that true victory begins within. The heart shaped by prayer becomes a place where God's peace reigns. From that peace flows wisdom, patience, and strength. Circumstances may change slowly or not at all, but the believer is no longer defined by them. The soul stands firm, grounded in trust, protected by faith, and quietly confident in the saving work of God, who transforms hearts and, in His time, all things.